welcome to Adobe Live. My name is Terry White. We're going to be talking about how to get started with Photoshop. And this is my live stream. This is not the official Adobe Live, which happens Tuesdays through Thursday on this very spot, on YouTube, that is. So welcome everyone. Indulge me for just a few minutes. We're going to get some basics out of the way, and I'm going to tell you kind of how this is going to go, because this is going to start a multi-part stream. Today we're going to kick things off with how to get started with Photoshop, some basics around just moving around inside the interface. If you're a Photoshop expert, you know Photoshop inside and out, then this probably won't be a lot of use to you. But if you're, on the other hand, someone who has either A, been struggling to learn Photoshop, or B, you're kind of self-taught and you maybe want to learn just to make sure you're doing things, I won't say the right way, but maybe one of the more efficient ways, then this is probably a series that you're going to want to watch. So I see some folks in the chat. Welcome everyone that's already here, and welcome for those of you that are going to watch the replay. Also, welcome on Twitter as well. I see some folks there watching this, and you are all welcome, and thank you for attending. So with that said, why don't I go ahead and switch over to my computer so you guys can see what I'm doing here. And I'm starting where most of you will start. I started with just Photoshop open with no document open. And at this point, it is now time to get started. So the first thing it's asking me is kind of, what do you want to do? Do you want to work at the very top, or do you want to learn? So a lot of the kind of how to do things in Photoshop are built right in. You can actually watch tutorials on how to do very specific things. So just know that that's always there as an option, and they're always adding new things to that Learn tab. Now, as far as getting started, with Photoshop, it's more for people, I shouldn't say more for people, it's people that generally use it are people that have an image that they want to work on, or multiple images that they want to work on. However, there are some people that use it that want to just start with a blank page and draw or paint or create art from scratch. So Photoshop can be used in either way. As you begin to work on documents, this getting started screen will fill up with your most recent files. However, I cleared it just to make sure that we're starting from scratch, meaning I don't even have any recent showing here. Now, as far as where you can get your work from, this is assuming that whatever it is you want to open is already on your hard drive somewhere, whether it's something you copied from a camera, or an image that you downloaded that you want to work on, or one that you scanned, or however you got that image into your computer. Photoshop is assuming that the image is on your computer somewhere ready to be opened. So to get started, you can of course go to Open and go find that image. You can also create a new image from scratch like we mentioned before. And you can also, if your images are in the cloud, you can go ahead and grab them from the cloud. So for example, if I go to my CC files, I've got a bunch of images there. If I go to my Lightroom photos, it will even show me the photos that I've synced with Lightroom in the cloud. So for example, I can go to Travel, and I can go to Detroit, which I just got back from this past weekend. Scroll down to the very bottom, which will show me my most recent ones. I took pictures of the ice on the Detroit River. And for example, if I wanted to work on one of those photos, I could go ahead and open it up right now, and it will import or download that particular photo from the cloud. So like I said, photos can either be worked on if they're already on your hard drive. Just go File, Open, go find it, open it up, double click on it. If Photoshop is set to be your default image editing program, it'll open it up that way. Or in my case, I went and found something on the cloud. I'm just going to go ahead and open it as is. Not going to make any changes there. And now I've got an image open, and this way we can talk about the interface. Now let's get into what this interface is all about and how it works and how you can maximize and get around inside of Photoshop. Because half of knowing Photoshop is knowing not only what you can do, but where certain things are, so that even if you don't remember how they work, you kind of know where you might go look for things. So Photoshop has tools on the left, menus at the top, panels on the right by default. Of course, that could all be changed around. People can move their interface around, but if you're starting out watching this tutorial and you kind of want to get where I am, you can go up to this little menu icon in the upper right corner. It looks like a little square. You can pull that down, and I'm starting out on the Essentials workspace. Now, when I first went to the Essentials workspace, it looked a little weird, so I hit Reset. Because sometimes if you are on a workspace and you move things around, that becomes the default for that workspace. So if you ever want to get back to the way it was really set up from scratch, you can hit reset, whatever the name of the workspace is, and that will reset it. So what I mean by that, let's talk about workspaces in general. What's a workspace, Terry? A workspace is basically just organizing where things are in Photoshop. So for example, starting out with Essentials is kind of where the basics are, where people will start out. But let's say you're more into photography. If I switch to the photography workspace, that will turn off some things, turn on some things, move some panels around that are going to be typically used by people doing photography. If I go over to graphic and web design, then it's going to, for example, put up the type panel because people typically are doing typography and they're working with their colors and libraries and things like that. So it will kind of show you things and even turn tools on and off now, which is a fairly new feature in Photoshop, based on whichever workspace you're on. And you can, of course, create your own workspace. So I've got one called Terry White Retouching and Terry White. So this is the workspace I use when I'm working on portraits or working on landscapes, because it's giving me all the tools I like to have on the left side. It's giving me all the panels I like to have on the right side. So workspaces are very cool. You'll explore them as we get further into this series. But just to let you know, I'm starting off with the Essentials workspace. All right, so let's get into where things are now. So we kind of got you where I am, basically on the Essentials workspace. And if you look on the left-hand side, you've got this series of tools. And these are the tools, I should say, these are the basic tools that most people will use. Now, it's not all the tools that Photoshop has, but these are the essentials, since we're in the Essential workspace. Now, these panels can be pulled apart and moved around. So I can pick my tools up and I can say, you know what, I kind of like my tools closer to the image. Or I like my tools in a double column fashion. That's another thing that can be done. By the way, this takes me back because this is the way Photoshop used to be in the 90s. It was two columns instead of one. You can move the panel around. You can put it even on the other side. You can even dock it on the other side just by moving it close enough to the other side. And if you like everything on one side, you can, of course, have everything on one side. If you ever get kind of like you've messed up your interface, remember, you can always go back and say Reset Essentials, and that will kind of put it all back to the way it was. I'm going to just collapse this one because I don't need it right now. All right. Okay, so that will get you back to where you started. Next up, we'll get into the tools in just a minute. You have these panels on the right-hand side. And the panels will basically control various aspects of the program. We'll get into what they control in a few minutes, but they can also be picked apart, torn apart, closed. Things that you don't use, you can put away. Things that you use all the time, you can pull out. For example, I would probably keep the layers panel handy because I'm always working with layers. Maybe I'll keep the properties panel handy because I'm always working with the properties. So this is what I mean by you can combine these panels in all the Adobe products, or 99% of the Adobe products, kind of the same way. And you can stack and dock them and create your own series of panels and tabs the way you want. So again, now I put properties and layers in the same panel. I put library under it. If I move the whole thing moves. And so that's kind of just Adobe Interface 101. Not specific to Photoshop, but just kind of reminding you of what you can and what you can do. And again, we'll reset it, put it back to the way it was. And we'll collapse that for a minute because I'm not ready for it. Let's put that back. Okay, so now over here on the left, the tools. And I didn't talk about the top because it kind of relates to what's going on with the tools. When you're on a specific tool, this control panel or options bar at the very top is actually it's context sensitive for whatever tool you're on. So for example, if I happen to be on the lasso tool, it's showing me all the options for lasso. If I'm on the type tool, it's showing me options for typing or putting in text. If I'm on the clone stamp tool, it's showing me options for the clone stamp tool. So this bar will always reflect the current conditions or current options for the tool you're working on. And just keep that in mind, that don't expect this to always look the same, because it will always look different based on what you've clicked on. Okay, what about the image itself? Or what if you had multiple images open? Or what if you want to move around in the image? You want to zoom in, you want to get closer to it, you want to zoom out. All of the zooming can be controlled from the tools or the keyboard. Photoshop's very keyboard friendly, so a lot of what you'll see me do later on in tutorials, I'll just be doing instinctively from the keyboard. But just to let you know, you've got this great magnifying tool. You can either click one at a time to zoom into a specific area, or with the later versions of Photoshop, you can actually drag and zoom in almost like in real time to zoom in or zoom out. So I'm just dragging diagonally up to zoom out, dragging in, down to zoom in. And you can even get to the real pixel level on an image. And zooming's very quick in doing that. All right, so with that said, if you ever want to zoom the image into 100%, this is kind of just a shortcut. Double click the magnifying glass right on the magnifying tool itself. If you want to zoom out to fit in window, you would double click the hand tool. And while you're zoomed in beyond 100%, beyond fit in window, the hand tool actually helps you move around. So that will help you, instead of you having to constantly scroll, you can just drag and flick the image around to get to the spots where you want. So that's very handy. And as you can see, I just kind of flick it and it kind of keeps sliding, almost like it's on a glass table and moving around. I'm not holding down anything. It just moves with its own motion until it stops. And of course, you can always scroll up and down, left and right, to get to the exact spot in the image you want. And of course, remember, you have zoom. Now, I would be remiss, I'm not going to spend a lot of time teaching you keyboard shortcuts, because that's kind of one of those things that people will tend to pick up on their own. But if you are into, I'm going to give you, like, over the course of this, like 10 keyboard shortcuts you should absolutely be using. One is, by the way, no matter what tool you're on, if you hold down the letter Z, it will let you zoom in, and then when you let go of the tool, the mouse and the Z, it will take you back to the tool you were on. So I was on the Move tool. I wanted to quickly zoom in without getting off the Move tool. So I can hold down the letter Z, zoom out, let go of the mouse, let go of the letter Z, and it takes me back to the Move tool or whatever tool you were on. So if I was on the lasso, trying to select something, and I need to zoom in to see it closer, I can zoom in, let go of the tool, let go of the mouse, and I'm back to the lasso. So that's kind of one of those where that's one of the top 10, because you're going to be zooming in and out constantly. And sometimes it's a pain in the butt to always have to remember, hey, Mike South, what's going on? It's always a pain in the butt to have to remember to go to the zoom tool, click it, zoom, then go back to the tool you were on. So Z for zoom, hold it down, zoom in, let go of the mouse, let go of the Z, and you're back to the tool you were in. Same thing for when you're zoomed in. Holding down the space bar will allow you to move around the image without having to necessarily click on the hand tool itself. I never click the hand tool because I'm just always using the space bar. So I hold down the space bar, I can move around, let go of the space bar, and I'm back to the tool I'm on. So that's two of your, we're probably gonna end up with more than 10, but 2 keyboard shortcuts you should walk away with from this session. The Z and or Z, depending on the country you're in, and the space bar for the hand tool. Okay. So we're zoomed out, we've got this image open, and you'll notice that this image is opened in a tab. Photoshop by default has got a tabbed interface. So if I were to go open up another image, let me go find another one to open here. And let's say that I want to open up this one. If I go open up another image, you're like, well, what happened to the ice? Well, the ice is still there, it's still open, it's in its tab. So I can click back and forth between the two. It will maintain whatever zoom level they're on. So if I wanted to zoom this one up to fit in window, double click the hand tool, I'm zoomed in now, or click back on the ice, I'm back on the ice. So you can work on multiple images at the same time. You can work on them individually or start combining images together. We'll get into more of that as this continues on. Hey, Cheryl, what's going on? And Heya and Matt and Evil Cerise, thanks for moderating. And Brad and everyone else that's in the chat, welcome everybody. So as we continue to work on these images, just know that you can have as many images open as your computer has enough RAM to hold. In other words, the more RAM your computer has, memory that is, the more images and the more things in Photoshop you can do at one time. If it's a lot of little web-sized images, you could probably have tens of dozens or hundreds of them open at one time. If they're huge, multi megapixel files, you might only be able to open 3 or 5 or 10 before your computer starts to really slow down, because it's all depending on how much RAM you have to have all those images open at one time with all that data open at one time. But usually most systems that can run Photoshop can easily get a few images open at one time with no struggle. And from there, it depends on the image, your computer, processor, memory, how big the image is, so forth and so on. All right, so with that said, we've got a couple of images open. If I wanted to close one, I can go in and just simply click the little X and that image is closed. Had I made any changes, it would actually ask me to make, save if I had made any changes. I didn't make any, so it just closed it without asking. But if I were to go back and open up that image again, it would open up in its own tab, open up a third one. I've got a third one open now. And these images are open in their own tab. I'm sorry, I hit a keyboard shortcut, double click the hand, and here we are. You wish it would remember the documents you had open in the last session. That's a good one. The recent files kind of handles that for most people, but it would be nice to have a open last session feature that would just simply open up all the tabs and open them all up for you. I agree with that. That's a good feature request. All right, so with that said, now what if you need to see more than one image at a time? Like I know I have that image open, I know I have this image open, but maybe I need to see these side by side so I can make some changes or make some adjustments. So under your window menu, because they moved this, it used to be on the control panel, but under the window menu, there's this arrange option. And as you can see, you can arrange your images to tile them vertically, to tile them horizontally, to have 2 up vertical, 2 up horizontal, vertical, 3 up horizontal, 3 up vertical, 3 up stacked, so forth and so on. So for example, if I were to say tile them vertically, it will do that. It will put them all in 3 different tiles. Now, you might not be able to see the entire image, but it's all there. So I can move the image around in each one of these. I can zoom in and zoom out in each one of these. And I can see multiple images open at the same time because I'm working with the 3 up now. I can also switch that arrangement. And I can say, tile horizontally. Maybe it works better if they're, depending on the way your monitors are in or the images. Maybe it's easier to work with them that way. We can also say, let's look at some of these 2 up horizontal. Now, what that means is that it will basically tab. I'm trying to find that other tab there. It will put 2 of them up and tab the other ones. So in other words, you're always looking at 2 at a time instead of all of them. So if I were to say arrange and do 3 up horizontal, then it will give me all 3. So you have different options for looking at. And if you ever say, oh my God, this is too much, get me back to my tabbed interface, all you have to do is say consolidate to all, no matter how many you have open, back to tabs, and you're back where you were. So you can always get out of it in case you just get bombarded with a bunch of different windows and it's hard to work. Okay. This is going to be a little bit more of an advanced feature, but you are going to learn it anyway. And while we're talking about these multiple images open at the same time, can you have 2 images open at the same time in the same window? In other words, I have this beautiful living area open, and I want to add another image onto it. In other words, I don't want a separate window. I don't want a separate file open. I want one that's right on top of it. Yes, you can. You can do it a few different ways. If you know that going in, for example, if you know, hey, I know right off the bat, I want to combine something on top of this image that with another image I already have, then you can do it this way. You can go to the file, and instead of open, you would choose place. One of the two place options, depending on what you want. So place embedded says, open up my file system, let me go find the photo I want, and it will find that photo and allow me to place it right on top of this one. That's one option. Depending on which way you want it to handle that place will be depending on which one you use. So place embedded means place that image on here, forget all about where that image came from. In other words, I don't need to keep that file on the hard drive because now I placed it here. Place linked means link to wherever I got it from so that if I go back and change the original, it will also update this one. So linked is fairly new. Photoshop in the past has always done an embed, but now you have a choice. So that's one way. If you know you want to place an image from another spot on your drive, just go File, Place, choose the place you want, bring it in, and it will put it on top. Does having multiple images open in the same window affect processing speed any more than just having multiple files open? It would be about the same. Because let's say you had two 10 megapixel files open side by side versus one 10 megapixel file open and another one on top as a layer, it's about the same amount of processing. It's maybe slightly different, but not enough to worry about. All right, so yeah, having two files open, whether they're separate or on top, will take up pretty much the same amount of processing speed. Okay, but having them on top of each other and saving that file will, of course, produce a bigger file because you're combining them together, if you're combining them as layers. Now, if you, let's say you place that second file, which we haven't even done yet, and you decide, that's it, I don't ever need to ever move it or touch it again, I want to combine it into this one permanently. If you merge the layer, now you're back down to dealing with just one file because it's no longer a separate image anymore as a separate layer or separate, it is still a separate file on the hard drive but not open. That would be one way to reduce the amount of processing it takes, but then you lose your flexibility on ever moving it around or doing something with it later. Let me show you that in a way that I think it'll be easier for you to understand if I just show it to you. So let's say that I want to find, I don't know, just for kicks, a shark image. Let's drag a shark image onto this. All right, and that's from Adobe stock. I haven't licensed that image. That's why it still has the watermark on it. But as I bring this in, it's saying, okay, where do you want it? I can move it around still. I can say that I want it down here in the lower left corner. How big do you want it? I can hold down my Shift key to scale it proportionally and size it down or size it up. I can get it where I want it to be. And then once I'm all set, however I brought that in, either with a place or drag and drop from a library like I just did, when I'm all set, then I hit either Enter on my keyboard or just simply check the option or click the check box in the option bar here or the control panel. And that will say, okay, now you've got that separate land shark. You've got that separate image in here. Now, if we go look at the layers panel, it will show me the original background and the sandbar shark swimming image. Now, what I meant by you still have flexibility is that's still a separate layer, a separate image. I can move it around still. I can delete it still. I haven't made it a permanent part of the background. So while I still keep that as a layer, I always have the ability to do something with it separately. The minute I say, no, flatten it down, merge it down, then it becomes a permanent part. Yes, taking up less resources, but definitely making it way, way, way more, or I should say way less flexible. So we tend not to merge layers unless we're absolutely 100% sure we're never going to come back and do something with it. So yes, this would require more processing power, but not, I don't think significantly as far as just having the two windows open. It's going to be the same. Photoshop has to keep both images in memory, whether they're sitting on top of each other or separately. All right, with that said, kind of got off on a tangent there. Let's get back to the interface itself. So let's continue. Hang on for a second here. Let me continue. Okay, good. Let's continue working with getting around in Photoshop. So we've talked about the tools, not what they do, but we've talked about the fact that you have tools. Another thing is that they're now, the tool tips are more extensive, sometimes even showing you videos with what they do. So if you hover over a tool and you just don't know what it does, it even shows you a little video about how that tool works. So the tools are definitely much more rich tooltips than they were before. Is that layer a smart object? I believe that one is, Reggie. Yes, it is. And placing will tend to make it a smart object as well. All right, so let's move on and talk about the menu options themselves. So if what you're looking for isn't a tool to do something, or isn't on a panel to adjust something that's already there, then most likely the only place left that that option would be is under one of the menus, because the menus have functions to control or do things that aren't necessarily in the tools or aren't necessarily in the panels. So typically, you're really going to be working with three areas of the program: the tools and the control panel. The option bar kind of put those two together. The panels on the right, or wherever you put them, and the menus. And however many windows you need open at one time. That's pretty much it. All right, Reggie, I'm glad you asked, and I'm glad I was able to answer. All right, so with that said, what are some other basics as far as the interface is concerned? We talked about sizing your windows down. We talked about multiple windows. We talked about tiling. We talked about closing. Like right now, if I go to close this, it's going to tell me, hey, are you sure you want to close this? Because you made changes now. I added the shark. So do you want to save this as a either updated file or new file? And in this case, it would have to be an updated file. We'll get into file formats later. Or no, meaning if I say no, I'm going to lose the shark work that I've added to this, and it will go back to being separate. The shark is still separate. The background for this would still be separate. I just wouldn't have that extra combination of those two layers anymore. Okay. We've got some time, so I'm going to get into some more basics as far as just working in Photoshop in general. And we're going to start the conversation, even though we're going to have to continue it in another segment. But just while you're here and while we kind of got a lot of the basics out of the way right off the bat, let's get into some of the manipulation options and working destructively versus non-destructively. Non-destructively, of course, is always preferred, but not always possible depending on what you're doing, and not always necessary depending on what you're doing. So people will debate me on that all day long, and that's okay. But you usually want to work non-destructively as possible. Let me give you an example of the opposite, something you don't want to do. You don't want to ever permanently edit pixels if you can avoid it, or if you know that you may want to make a change to what you're doing later. That's why we tend to want to work non-destructively. So for example, let's say that my client says, hey, they find maybe this one. This light is a distraction. They would like it removed from the photo. So that could be done. But right now I'm working on the original image. So if I remove it and I save it and I don't make a copy or I don't work non-destructively, then I hope they really like that change, because it will be harder to bring it back. Not impossible, but harder. So for example, one of the things I could do, one of the tools in Photoshop is the patch tool, one of my favorites. So I could make a selection. I'm not even using my stylus. I'm just using a mouse, which I highly recommend a stylus. But anyway, and then notice it's now giving me an option to move in the direction that is saying drag it to one side or the other, or drag it somewhere to actually make the patch happen. So I'm just going to drag it over here, which I love the patch tool because it gives me that preview of what it should look like when it's finished. And then I'm going to go ahead and say okay. And it's done. It did it. If I deselect, because I worked on the background, if we go to our layers panel, I didn't make a copy, I didn't duplicate it, I didn't do anything else. If I now save this and close it, that change is permanent. Meaning that when I open it back up, that light is gone. It is always gone. It is gone for good. And if they said, oh, we meant the one on the left, not the one on the right, then I would have to manually put it back somehow, maybe clone this one back into that spot and try and make it look like it belonged there. It's much easier to work non-destructively and have a way out than it is to have to put something back or change something back later and make it look like the original. So I could do this a couple of ways. If I'm pretty sure that that's the change that they wanted to make, But, you know, they could always come back and say, no, we didn't really want that light. I could just simply do what we've done for years in all programs. Save this as a separate name. Save it as a separate file. Go up to File menu, do a Save As. Give it a new name. So spacious apartment, modern apartment, minus right light. And save it wherever I'm saving this. Okay, so now I basically have saved this out as a copy. That means I still have the original to go back to, the original one that I opened, which is over here in my panel somewhere in my library. There it is. So I still have that one because I saved the change I made as a new file. So that's one way to do it. And that goes back as far as save as far as computing goes back. You've been doing that in word processing. You've been doing that in every program that can do save. You always could do a save as, and that way you have that one to always come back to your original. Now, but in Photoshop, we typically don't rely so much on save as because you're making so many changes. In other words, chances are you're not going to just do one thing, and saving a bunch of copies of the file is probably not that productive, not the most efficient way to do it. So instead, we tend to work in these things that are called layers. That way, we can make changes to our layers without affecting the original. We can experiment, we can duplicate, we can do all kinds of things and turn layers on and off to always get back to the original. That way, if we do go too far, the client changes their mind, we have a way to get home, a way to get back. There's also a feature called Smart Objects, which someone asked about earlier. There are all kinds of ways to work non-destructively in Photoshop as kind of a safety net to get back to where you were. So for example, instead of me doing a save as, let's say the client said, hey, can you remove that light on the right? And I'm like, yeah, I've worked with this client before. They tend to change their mind. I'm going to protect myself this time. So in the layers panel, which we're going to do a whole thing on layers. So you don't have to learn everything about layers today. In the layers panel, what I can do is I can say, I want to make a copy of this background layer so that way I have the original to return to. You can make a copy several different ways, from the keyboard, from the layers panel, from the file menu, or from the layer menu, lots of ways. One of the quickest ways to do it in the layers panel itself is to just simply take whatever layer you want to make a copy of and drag it down to the new layer icon. Before we do that, because this is basics, what are layers? Before we make a copy of this one, turn it into a layer, what are layers in the first place? What are they for? Here's one of the examples I used to teach years and years and years ago about layers. Layers are like having your original photo and putting clear pieces of acetate on top so that whatever you do on the acetate does not affect the original photo underneath. So for example, if I take my paintbrush, which right now has gold paint, and I were to say, hey, I like the letter A. Let's make a letter A there. I have permanently painted that on the background. I've literally spray painted my wall. And while I could clone it out and stamp it out and patch it out and get it back to the original, it's best just not to do that. In other words, if you can avoid it, don't work on the original if you can. So I can get out of that. I'll talk about multiple undos in a minute. But instead, what I would do is maybe make a new layer. So I just click the new layer icon. It always names it layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, so forth and so on. And I'm going to call this letter A on the wall. So now I even know what that layer is for. And so now if I were to go and paint and say, hey, I like the letter A on the wall. And the client's like, why did you do that? What's that for? Don't ever do that again. Then I could just simply turn that layer off, right back to the original, or even better yet, throw that layer away, right back to the original. Or while I'm on that layer, I could even erase, this is my erase tool, right? Okay. My erase tool has a weird brush right now, hold on. There we go. I could even erase part of the A and not erase the wall because I'm only on the letter A layer. So you can Work with layers. You can have multiple layers. You can have tens of 20 of hundreds of layers, depending on how much RAM you have, how big your file is, so forth and so on. So you can work with lots of layers, so that way if you ever change your mind, you're not permanently stuck. You can always go back and change a layer or get rid of a layer or turn off a layer to get back to where you were or make changes to just what's on that layer. So the example we were going to make as far as that removing that light is I want a backup copy of the background itself. So what I want to do is duplicate this layer. And so instead of, here's what I did. So instead of clicking, giving me a new layer, what I said was take the existing layer down to that same icon and just give me a copy of it. And it's calling it background copy. And I can call it whatever I want. Minus right light or whatever, ceiling light, whatever you want to say. So now I've got two layers that look exactly the same because I haven't done anything to either one yet. But now on this minus right layer, I can go to my, my patch tool and I can say, you know what? That light needs to go. But now if they come back and say, no, we meant the other one, I just go back to the original. I could even say, well, I don't know which one they meant. They said remove one of the rear lights. Make another copy. Minus left light. And I can now get rid of this one on this layer. There we go. So depending on which one they want, that one's minus the right light. That one's minus the left light. That one's turn them both off. They get both lights back. So that way you have the ability to always get back to where you started. Some people like to get back to where they started just by keeping it a copy of the original file. Yes, that's great. But working with layers, which we're going to do a whole segment on, lets you really work in the same file with having options. And Justin, I'm glad you're finding this to be awesome. I put this series together to get people kind of up to speed on their Photoshop or their Creative Cloud version of Photoshop, so they really can take advantage of what you paid for or what you're paying for. Okay, so let me go over some common pitfalls in the last few minutes of this. And this is kind of like alleviating some of that frustration that I hear people, especially people that are beginners, that they run into. So let's go back to the background for a minute. Or you know what? No, let's turn on these layers. Let's turn this layer on. Let's go back to this top layer now. All right, let's say that I want to, let's see if I can find a good example here. I don't know. I want to work with the clock. It's right there in front of me. I want to make the clock, I don't know, brighter. I want to change the exposure of it. Well, okay. I know that there are adjustments in Photoshop. So let me see if I can find the adjustments here. There they are. And if I go to my exposure, ooh, there it is. I can click on exposure and I can say, ooh, make the clock brighter. It didn't really just make the clock brighter. It made everything brighter. So what I used to teach my students back in the day, one simple thing to remember. In Photoshop, you select to effect. In other words, if you just want to affect part of the photo, then you need to select that part of the photo. You either need to select it or separate it onto its own layer, either one. And that way, whenever you make a change, you're only making that change to that specific area. All right, so with that said, I just want to affect the clock. So therefore, I need to select the clock first or separate the clock from where we are now so that whatever I do to the clock only affects the clock. So how would I do that? Photoshop has a variety of selection tools, which again, we're going to spend the whole section on just making selections. But this is kind of just getting you around in the interface. So one of the things I'm glad I did this because it's reminding me to bring up this part of the interface is that whatever tools you see, if you see a little arrow in the bottom right-hand corner of that tool, like these little triangles, that means that there are more tools underneath. So when I click down on that little arrow, it's showing me that this isn't just the patch tool, it's the spot healing tool, the healing brush, the patch tool, the content aware, and red eye tool. So otherwise, the Photoshop tool menu would literally be a mile long if they didn't combine multiple tools together, because there's so many. So if you see those little arrows, that means that whatever tool you're on, there are more tools underneath it. So that's another interface or another getting around Photoshop thing. So with that said, I want to make a selection, but I know that there are more selection tools. For example, the magic wand's been around for years, but I know there's a newer tool called the quick selection tool. So I just held down on the magic wand tool to get to the quick selection tool. And I'm going to, first of all, hold down the letter Z and zoom in so I can just get the clock area. And now here's another interface thing. The selection that it's trying to make is too big. It's going to get more than the clock. So I need a smaller quick select tool, or a smaller or bigger paintbrush, or a smaller or bigger clone stamp tool. In other words, what I'm about to tell you works across the board on the tools that have an actual size. So in this case, that tool is just too big to even select the clock unless I keep zooming in. So what I want to do is simply make that tool smaller. So I can do that by adjusting, I'll show it to you the organic way of doing it first. I can just adjust the size from this menu. But when I do it that way, then I'm kind of guessing because I don't know how big I need it to be until I see it. So that's a way to do it. And it's a way that's been there for a while. Been there pretty much from day one. But it's not the way I do it anymore because I like to do it from the keyboard so I can visually see how big that brush is going to be or how big that tool is going to be. So for example, if I hit my right bracket tool, and I'm sorry if your keyboard in the country you are in doesn't have bracket keys, because I ran into that. I would say hit the right bracket key and people were like, my keyboard doesn't have a bracket key. So on a US keyboard, the bracket keys are next to the letter P as in Paul. So there's a left bracket, which makes the brush smaller. There's a right bracket, which makes the brush bigger. If your keyboard doesn't have bracket keys, I don't know what the keyboard equivalent would be. So you could either go find it in the keyboard shortcuts or just simply use the brush size. All right, so I'm going to make my brush a little smaller. And the way this tool works is you just basically either click to make a selection, and it kind of did a great job there. It missed a spot there, and I can just keep clicking to add the spots that it missed. So it missed the 12. And what it's trying to do is it's using a little bit of artificial intelligence and algorithm to try and figure out, you clicked on this thing, because all Photoshop is just pixels, black, white, brown, green, orange, whatever. So it's saying, hey, I kind of know these pixels kind of look the same. Maybe you're trying to select all of these. Oh, but that 12 looks different. Maybe you don't want to select that. So it's guessing, but it keeps getting smarter the more you use it on a particular selection. All right, so now it's selected the clock and the shadow. That's great. So here's my choice. I can go ahead and adjust the exposure right now. Oop, hang on, sorry. I have that layer mask still there. Get rid of that one first. Okay, I can still make that adjustment that we just made. Back to the adjustments here. Go to exposure, and now it will do it just on the clock. That's great. Make the clock darker, make the clock lighter, but keep in mind, we're making a permanent change. Get back to that. Or do you want to do it on this layer? Do you want to do it on this background? Do you want to do it right now? Because once you make that change and click OK, you've made that change. So always think, hang on, let me get back to the selection. Always think, do I really want to make it on the layer I'm on or on the background I'm on? And when you make a selection, you're isolating that area to only be affected. So for example, even if I grab the paintbrush, this is pretty cool to illustrate my point about making selections. I got this gold paintbrush. I'm painting out here, nothing's happening. But as soon as I cross the clock or the selected area, it gets painted because you can only affect the area that's selected. So when you have something selected, only whatever you're doing is going to affect that area. Or if you're doing something outside that area, nothing's going to happen. All right, so with that said, what I might want to do is take this selection and make its own layer, make a clock layer basically. So I can do that from my layers panel. I can go up to my new layer via a copy. In other words, make a copy of what I have selected onto a new layer. So there's a new layer. Doesn't look like it has anything on it, but it does. And if I were to turn off all the other layers, the only thing on that layer is the clock, because we copied that selection onto its own layer. So now I can make all the adjustments to that layer all day long and not affect the originals. Now, because we have multiple originals underneath, I would just be affecting that one layer, that one clock layer. So if I were to paint now, okay, here's a trivia question. If I paint right now, will it paint the wall? Or I should say, will paint appear on the wall? That's a better way to ask it. Yes or no? So I'll give you guys a second to answer that. Let's see if you're starting to understand how layers work. Will paint appear on the wall if I paint right now? Or will it only be isolated to the clock? Miguel, hello. All right, M South says, no, it will not appear on the wall. Does everyone agree with him? I'll give YouTube a chance to catch up. Only on the clock. Okay. Sam says, yes, it will appear on the wall. Reggie says yes. Loft says yes. Everyone on YouTube saying yes. Everyone on Twitter saying no. That's so weird. All right. YouTube, you're correct. Because if I paint right now, yes, of course it appears on the wall. It's not actually on the wall. It's on that layer. But that layer is above everything else, which appears on the wall. So that's why I changed the way I said it. Will it appear on the wall? Not be on the wall. Because you're right, it is not on the wall. It's on the empty part of the clock layer. But because that's above everything else, it appears to be on the wall. So bingo, Loft, you're right. So undo. So while I can make adjustments to just that layer and that layer alone, and that's all that will appear, if I add new pixels to the blank part of that layer, it's above everything else. So there we are. All right, so for example, if I were to adjust the exposure this way or the lighting this way using the levels controls, I'm only affecting the clock because I'm on the clock layer. You'll get used to it after a while. And that's why we're going to spend more time on layers, just a whole thing on layers. But that's kind of how layers work. So they're like those clear pieces of acetate, which right now the clock's on a clear piece of acetate by itself. But if you paint on that acetate, you're going to put paint all over the acetate, not just the clock. So it will appear as if it's on the rest of the photo, even though it isn't, which is a good thing. All right, so that's leading me up to my frustration thing that I was supposed to do. All right, the part that I was supposed to do, and the reason we did this in the first place, is because sometimes, and I'll go down to this layer here, sometimes you'll make a selection of an area. This time I'll just use the regular marquee selection, because that's kind of rectangular. And you may either have made that selection by accident, you forgot you made the selection and forgot to deselect, you just have something selected that another tool left selected or some other function left selected. And worse, you don't even see it because it's over there now. It's off to the side. So now you're trying to paint on that green leaf, and you're trying to make the leaves look yellow. And you're like, how come no paint is coming onto my leaves? And the minute I start doing something and I know something should be appearing there, I immediately think you've got something else selected. I don't even go look for what the selection is. We know where it is now, but I'll show you a quick way to get out of it. But let me show it to you visually first. If we go back over, it's like, oh yeah, I can't paint over here on the leaves because this is still selected. And it will not let me do anything outside of the selected area. How do we deselect? Back in the old days, and if you're self-taught, you may deselect the way you deselect in all the other programs by clicking somewhere else. That is much more work than you need to do inside of Photoshop. So instead of going back to the selection tool and just clicking somewhere else so you can deselect, there's actually a command for it. If you go to the select menu, there's a deselect command. So let me give you, hang on, let me give the scenario again. I've made that selection over there, and I scrolled over and I said, hey, I want to be painting on my leaves there. And I go to start painting and nothing happens because, oh yeah, that's right, that other thing's still selected and I forgot to deselect it. I don't even scroll over, I don't go click somewhere else, I don't switch tools, I don't do any of that. I don't even go to the menu because it's a keyboard shortcut. Command D on Mac, PC Control D. When you deselect, you don't even have to see it happen, I just hit Command D. Now I can paint over here because I know wherever I had a selection, wherever I left one somewhere, Command D deselected it, and now I can keep working. So one of the easiest frustrations to do or get rid of is Command D or Control D on Windows to remember that deselect. That way you won't have to go back and find where your selection is or switch to another tool and deselect. Just Command D. You know you've deselected anything that's still selected, and that will let you continue to work and work outside the selected area because it's no longer selected. All right, another interface thing, and this is kind of one of those things where the Photoshop team is well aware that this is 2018 and this needs to change, but it hasn't changed yet. So let me indicate what it is. I can undo, just like I can and have been doing since 1984. However, Photoshop has always only had one undo. I'm being very specific here. So for example, if I do this, and then I do this, and I'm by no means touting this as good Photoshop work, I'm just showing you paint strokes here. Now I've done this 4 times. If I undo, great. Well, this is 2018, right? I should be able to keep undoing. And I undo again. Oh, wait, it brought it back. Command Z or Control Z on Windows, the same undo you do everywhere else where you would just keep hitting Command Z or Control Z, doesn't work that way in Photoshop, at least not today. So when you do an undo in Photoshop, it's literally just toggling between undo and redo, whatever your last thing was. But that doesn't mean Photoshop can't multiple undo. I just did it. What's the secret? If you make multiple steps, these are bad. We wouldn't want these. Undo will only undo the last one, but there is a step backward and step forward. So step backward on the Mac is Command Option Z, PC Control Alt Z. So if I do Command Option Z, Command Option Z, Command Option Z, that will step back in time to do my multiple undos. So Command Z is still there, Control Z is still there to undo the last thing you just did, but when you want to step back, add the Alt key or Option key to the mix, and that will let you step back in time or just do it from the menu. And it only has a limit of so many undos, and let me show you where that is from an interface perspective. It's under, I believe it's under performance. Let me go to performance here. History states. Photoshop defaults to 50. You got plenty of memory, you can increase it. You can increase it up to 1,000 if you got enough memory for it. I don't recommend you go to 1,000. If you need to undo your last 1,000 steps, time to find a new program to work in. Photoshop's not your thing. Just kidding. But if you need to undo more than 75 or 100 things, your workflow needs to change. Because you shouldn't need to go back that far. All right, so 50 is the default. It used to be 20, so now it's 50, and you can change it. If you got more RAM, you can change it to a higher number. And that means I can hit Command Option Z 50 times to go back and undo my last 50 things. If I need to go back 51 and it's still on 50, oh well. That's when you should have used other things like layers or other things to get back to where you were. All right, so that's another interface thing, is just how undo works, because it is different in Photoshop than it is in any other application you use. All right, let me think. We got like 5 minutes left in this. Let me make sure. Any questions about getting started or what you would like to see in the next upcoming segment, which is next Friday? We're going to do these on Mondays, but next Monday's taken on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to do this one time next Friday, and then it'll be Mondays from here on out. Because, hey, it's Monday. Why not? So anything you guys would like to see? Does saving the file save the undos? No. History is not saved with, that's a good question. History is not saved with the file. So if I did 20 things and I save and I close and I come back, oh, I didn't mean to do those last 5. No, there's no undo. It's in memory. So that's why you need so much memory to have so many undos. If you close the file, saved or not, you've lost those 20, 50, 75, how many ever undos or history states you had selected. Very good question. Thanks for bringing that up. Any other questions for our last few minutes? Anything you'd like to see, or anything like in the interface that still got you questioning what's going on? How do I do this? Now's the time to ask. Dun, dun, dun. Now, I'm also using keyboard shortcuts to zoom in and zoom out, even though I showed you the zoom tool. Why is the adjustment panel not part of the tool panel? Okay, so asking me questions about the design of the program, I won't be able to answer that. Why isn't it? I don't know, because they felt it should be separate. Okay, there's your answer. So that doesn't really help. So ask me things that I can actually answer. If you have specific features or the way you think it should work, then that's when you go give the feedback on the adobe.com feedback page to give actual feedback of what you would like to see changed. Okay, so what time on Mondays? 1 p.m. Pacific time. Please, could you detail the tools? Of course, layers. Yep, those are going to be separate segments. Rather, how is it different? Okay, that's a better question. So the better question is, you have the options bar up here at the top, and now the properties panel over here on the, oh, sorry, that's the history panel. Properties panel over here on the right. How is it different? Well, the options bar usually is going to give you more. I would say that probably what we will see over time is more things transitioning to the properties panel that used to be separate. In other words, like if I wanted to go to I wanted to add some type, but I also wanted to resize my type. Right now I'd have to be in 2 different tools to do that, and therefore my options bar would be reflected differently. I could see both of those options being in one properties panel segment. So think of the properties panel as the options bar control panel 2.0 on steroids. More options for the kinds of things that you're going to want to do in the future combined together so that you don't have to keep switching tools to do them. That's where the property panel is headed. And that's a better question than why is it there? All right. Cool. I'm glad you make the whole picture black and white. All right. You want to make the whole picture black and white? That's a quick one and an easy one. We go to our adjustments panel and we click the black and white. Done. That was easy. So we'll talk about this when we talk about layers, but what that just did is it did make it permanent, and it put it in the wrong spot, by the way. It made an adjustment layer that's black and white that I could turn back off and get right back to color, or turn back on and get right back to black and white. Layers mask, layer mask, mic's off. We're going to do that when we talk about layers in another segment. Good one, good one, good one. Great. All right, last 15 seconds. So with that said, oops, sorry about that. Thanks everyone for watching. We will catch you on the next one. I'll be back on this channel next Friday at 1 p.m. doing part 2. Part 2 might be layers. I can't remember what part 2 is going to be, but we'll be doing part 2 of this ongoing series until we get you all to be Photoshop masters and you know Photoshop inside and out. So this one was kind of like in multiple places and diving deep into some of the other areas that we didn't really want to get into today or that we're going to talk about separate, but I think it will help you just kind of explaining how some of these things work. When saving and closing a window, options need to save the version, not over the file. I would suggest that Adobe. Usually if you're saving over, oh, you mean if you hit save, that is replacing the one you're on because you're updating. If you want to not replace the one you have, do a save as. So that is kind of built in. And if you do a save as with the same name to the same location, it's going to ask you, do you want to replace the original? So that's kind of already there. But if you're saying you want an option where you hit Command S to always iterate, then that's something different. All right. Cheers, everybody. Take care. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye.